Hello, everyone, and welcome to this webinar on the crisis in Kazakhstan and the related issues of regional security and the role of Russia. This webinar is co-organized by the Stockholm Centre for Eastern European Studies, SCEEUS, and the Institute for Security and Development Policy, ISDP. SCEEUS was established last year and is independent but financed by the Swedish government and organizationally located at the Swedish Institute of International Affairs, SCEEUS. ISDP is a Stockholm-based non-profit and non-partisan research and policy organization. My name is Hugo von Essen. I work as an analyst at SCEEUS, and I have the pleasure of moderating today's webinar. With me, I'm honored to have three excellent speakers for this webinar: Svante Cornell, Director of the Institute for Security and Development Policy; Erika Holmqvist, Senior Analyst with the Asia and Middle East Program at the Swedish Defense Research Agency, FOI; and my colleague and fellow analyst at SCEEUS, Jakob Hedenskog. Thank you all for your participation and very welcome. Today's webinar will start off by an initial discussion between our speakers on the central issues and questions, and then later we will bring in questions from the audience. Those of you in the audience who participate via Zoom are able to ask questions through the Q&A function down in the center of your screens. And if you're watching our live stream on Facebook, please use the comment field there for questions. I will then gather the questions and bring them into the discussion later. I would also like to add that this webinar is being recorded and will be available to watch later at the UI website, ui.se. The topic for today's webinar is the crisis in Kazakhstan in January this year, the events that followed this, and the broader implications these have for Kazakhstan, for regional security, and for outside powers with interests in this region and in Kazakhstan. Before I give the word over to our speakers, I will briefly outline the events in Kazakhstan in January and what related questions and issues that this webinar aims to illuminate and provide answers to. On the 2nd of January this year, protests erupted in Western Kazakhstan. The originally relatively unorganized protests rapidly spread nationwide and widened to demands for political reform and changes to the country's leadership. The protests culminated in large street clashes between protesters and police, and more than 200 people died while over 12,000 have been detained. On the 6th of January, following a request for assistance by President Tokayev of Kazakhstan, troops began arriving from other members of the Collective Security Treaty Organization, CSTO, a Russia-dominated security alliance of 6 former Soviet republics: Russia, Belarus, Armenia, Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, and Kyrgyzstan, created in 1992. The CSTO troops were used to guard strategic facilities and not to participate in action against the protesters. With the help of these CSTO troops, Kazakhstan security forces managed to take control of the situation, and the CSTO troops were then all withdrawn by the 19th of January. So some of the issues that our discussants will provide their thoughts and analysis on today are the following. Why do these events matter for Kazakhstan and other actors in the region? What was behind the crisis? Why did the CSTO intervene? And what implications do these events and their outcome have for Kazakhstan's internal politics, for regional security, and for other actors such as Russia, China, and the West? And finally, what comes next? So, having said all of that, I will now give the word to our speakers, beginning with Svante Cornell of ISDP. So, Svante, could you please tell us more about what has happened and what your reflections are on all of this?
Thank you very much, Hugo. It's a pleasure to be with you today, and we're very glad to be engaging in this joint venture with your center. Regarding the events in Kazakhstan, I would like to briefly outline what I think the crisis was about and the issues that are at stake. So the crisis was, at least in my analysis, equally about what we could call the social contract in Kazakhstan and equally about the elite politics within the country. And to make it very simple, I think the scenarios going forward are 2 different ones. One is where the event accelerates the transformation of the country in a positive direction. And there is also a negative scenario in which this is, so to speak, only a harbinger of things to come. And a preliminary note, in order to, so to speak, put the situation in context, I'd like to mention that when we look at Central Asia, very often we see this as a kind of a homogeneous region with stands, quote unquote. assuming that the social structures and cultures of the countries in Central Asia are very similar. Well, they're not. There are very different social structures in the region, and they essentially, although there are many different divisions, one key division is that between the settled and the nomadic cultures, where the settled peoples like the Uzbeks, Tajiks, Azerbaijanis over the other side of the Caspian have relatively hierarchical societies. They tend to be more conservative. You can see this, for example, in the gender relations in the region, for example. But the point here, I think, is that these societies tend to be more acceptant of hierarchies, whether it be social hierarchies or political hierarchies. Of course, I'm generalizing here, but the nomadic peoples, Kazakhs and Kyrgyz in particular, have flatter social structures, historically more balanced in terms of gender roles, for example, and that tend to be more rejecting of hierarchies. And I mention this because Kazakhstan society is very much similar to Kyrgyzstan society. And as we know, Kyrgyzstan has a rather unruly political history in the past 30 years with several upheavals, changes of power. I think this also explains partly why we have had a significant amount of protests taking place in Kazakhstan in recent years, much more than you've seen in, for example, Uzbekistan or any other country of the region. And I think the point here is that the regime type that Nursultan Nazarbayev introduced in Kazakhstan 30 years ago did not really fit with, so to speak, if there is such a thing, the character of Kazakhstan society. I think it was possible at the time and served a purpose for three reasons. First, that in the late Soviet period, Kazakhstan was still recovering from what was essentially the destruction of the nation in the 1930s, where up to 40% of the population died in the forced collectivization under Stalin, which, by the way, percentually speaking, was a worse outcome than the Holodomor in Ukraine. And secondly, because of this, Kazakhstan was not culturally a Kazakh society. The Kazakhs were a 40% minority. There was a serious risk of ethnic conflict, and they needed to very carefully manage building a state while maintaining interethnic relations with the Russians in the north of the country. This also led to a more hierarchical system of power in order to manage this transition. And I think third, the oil and gas wealth of the country made rapid economic growth possible. It empowered the state and it allowed for a more centralized system of government. Now, those three conditions are really no longer there. Kazakhstan has come a long way towards building a nation and a state. The demography is completely different, with Kazakhs now over 75% of the population. And of course, the oil-driven economy is no longer a feasible way of running the country in the long run. So because of all these reasons, what we see now, I would argue, is the process of negotiating a transition away from a strict hierarchical system, from an authoritarian government to, well, we don't know what it's going to be. Now, this leads us to the question of the social contract. Now, the social contract in Kazakhstan, very much similar to many oil-producing states, was based on the government ruling but providing stability and constantly rising living standards to the population. This was the case until 2015. From 2015 onward, this was not a functioning social contract anymore, partly because of the success of Kazakhstan, creating a middle class that clearly wanted more and wasn't necessarily happy with just putting food on the table anymore. As we know from a lot of sociological studies, this is nothing this is what should be expected. But also because it was clear after the oil price collapses of 2014 that this system was no longer delivering. We've seen a decrease in GDP over the past several years, for example, that showed that the state wasn't really delivering its part of the social contract. And this is where we have an overlap with elite politics. We saw already before this a division between a reformist liberal group in the state bureaucracy and the intelligentsia, and on the other side, a class that we could call the primary beneficiaries of Nazarbayev's model of government. That's not just his family. It includes his family, but a lot of other people too, some of whose names we don't know, who stood to lose a lot from change and from reforms. Now, because of the rising social dissatisfaction and his advanced age, Nazarbayev began to, or approved, a gradual controlled transfer of authority to Tokayev, and which means to the reformist camp. But if we go back and look, we see that the ink had hardly dried before it was clear that many in Nazarbayev circles were actively working against Tokayev and slowing the reform process. We don't know. Was this on the orders of Nazarbayev? Was this without the knowledge of Nazarbayev? Or was it against the orders of Nazarbayev? We don't know the answers to those questions. But we do know that the reformists understood that a rapid, aggressive political and economic reform process was needed to safeguard the stability of the country and to avoid popular discontent from boiling over. President Tokayev was a leader of this group, but he was, I think, until recently at least, unable to assert significant authority, enough at least to drive his intentions through. We see that the protests that emerged in January in Western Kazakhstan had nothing to do with elite politics. They had everything to do with the social dissatisfaction that I mentioned. But in Almaty, on January 4 and January 5, we see a clear change of character of these protests, a shift to violent rioting that may very well have been linked to elite politics. There's a suspicion that the role of the security services was either to facilitate or at best to ignore the violent riots that very different people were involved in compared to the original peaceful protests. And I think this is the context in which the appeal to the CSTO makes sense, by a conclusion from the president's side that the loyalty of the security services and law enforcement could no longer be trusted, and that only firm external support and rapid external support could provide a sufficient deterrent against what he suspected, rightly or wrongly, would be coup makers. We can also discuss separately why Russia would support reformers, as in this case, it's a very counterintuitive proposition. But I think it's clear that Mr. Putin has a penchant for, should we say, sitting authorities and for stability rather than revolution and unrest in neighboring countries, unless, of course, he is the one that instigates that unrest. So in conclusion, I think this crisis was very costly for Kazakhstan's international image and for the position of the government. But it also provided a chance for the leadership in the country to clean house and perhaps decisively, we don't know yet, but perhaps decisively to rid the executive of the forces that were impeding the reform process in the country. Now, I want to be clear that Mr. Tokayev is a reformist, but it doesn't mean that he wants Kazakhstan to become a liberal democracy, and certainly not today. He is strongly steeped in the political culture of Kazakhstan, which believes in evolutionary reform, and is a very strong opponent to so-called color revolutions, which I think the Kazakhstani leadership as a whole sees as something that threatens stability and even the sovereignty of the country. They may have a point, as we've seen from some of the countries that have been involved in these type of processes. There's also a very clear situation in which the big neighbors, China and Russia, resolutely oppose liberalization and will work to stop it, just as they've done in Georgia, in Ukraine, in Moldova, or as in the case of Armenia, they paid a lot for, in terms of territorial control, for their political changes. So the question in Kazakhstan is, how much liberalization is needed to avoid renewed popular unrest? How much is too little and how much is too much? It's a very difficult task for the government, and it's very difficult also for Kazakhstan's foreign partners. Just a final word on the implications beyond Kazakhstan. I think we should note that President Nazarbayev, or former President Nazarbayev, deserves some credit for trying to introduce a controlled succession of power instead of just dying at his post, as so many other people in this region have done. The problem is that it didn't work. And it didn't work because there was a transfer, should we say a partial transfer, of formal political power, but not a transfer of informal political and economic power over the country's assets. And this, I believe, is, by the way, the underlying reason why post-Soviet states have found it so difficult to reform, either by regime change or by evolutionary changes, because of the strong role of informal power and the fusion of political and economic power. Nobody has really been able to resolve this, and it remains to be seen if Kazakhstan will be able to do so. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Santa. A lot of very interesting points that I hope we can return to a bit later in the seminar. I will now turn to Erika, our next speaker, Erika Holmqvist of FOI. So Erika, what's your view on the events in Kazakhstan and their implications from your perspective?
Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me. I feel like I already learned a lot in these past 5 minutes. So I have a couple of reflections. that I'm going to share with you. First of all, in regards to the events in Kazakhstan in January, it was surprising to me that the government asked the CSTO to step in, because up until now, my understanding has been that Kazakhstan has pursued a pretty complicated policy of, on the one hand, humoring Russian integration initiatives, while at the same time being quite aware of the risks of cooperating too closely. And all the Central Asian states are concerned with preserving their independence from Russia, but they have chosen different strategies to do so. Some, like Kazakhstan, have chosen to join Russia-led organizations like the CSTO in order to keep Russia close. And some, like, for example, Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan, have chosen to stay out of them to keep Russia at arm's length. But they all share the same concerns. And following Russia's invasion of Crimea in 2014, Kazakhstan and the other Central Asian states learned that they can't trust Russia to honor the territorial integrity of former Soviet states. And because of that, I think asking the CSTO for help was probably not something that was done lightly. And it makes me believe that the Kazakh regime must have truly feared for its survival. The annexation of Crimea made space for China's role in Central Asia to grow. A few years ago, some colleagues and I, including my co-panelist here today, Jakob Hedenskog, we did a research project that focused on Russia's role in Central Asia and how it was perceived in the Central Asian states. And what we found was that Russia was no longer viewed as the only important external power in the region. And the impression was that Russia can offer the region hard security, but not very much else. Russia can't compete with China in terms of economic development, which is something that naturally all the Central Asian states want. And China has become a huge investor in Central Asia, especially in the infrastructure and in energy sectors. And a huge part of these investments have actually gone to Kazakhstan. China has also made some efforts towards security cooperation in Central Asia via the SCEEUS and also through bilateral arrangements. The main focus is on limiting terrorism threats towards China. But so far, China appears to have little interest in playing a large role in the security field, which is highlighted by Kazakhstan's choice to turn to the CSTO for help. And in regards to the Kazakhstan protests, China didn't react very much, or at least not in public. But supposedly, Xi Jinping commended Tokayev for stopping a color revolution. And this is my other reflection, that the fear of color revolutions and the constant struggle to ensure regime survival is a common theme that preoccupies many regimes surrounding Central Asia, all the way from China to the Middle East to Russia. And it's kind of interesting to see that the framing of protests and dismissal of legitimate popular grievances is almost always the same. Just to give you one example, in 2019, we saw protests spread all over Iran. And the protests have been triggered by an increase in fuel prices. And these protests evolved into a broader critique of the Iranian regime. And the regime responded with killing hundreds of people and imprisoning thousands. And the official narrative was that the protests were instigated from abroad with the goal to overthrow the government. and protesters were prosecuted as terrorists. This is quite similar to what has happened in Kazakhstan in January. And I suspect that in Kazakhstan, as well as in Iran, a more important problem than terrorism is actually corruption and wealth redistribution. But as is often the case, ordinary people are the ones who have to pay the price for the lack of accountability. And Kazakhstan used to be perceived as a success story in Central Asia. But I think now that image has been tarnished. I think I'll stop there for now.
Thank you, Rika. Very interesting, especially the comparison with Iran. So before the next speaker, I would just like to remind the audience to feel free to ask questions. If you are on Zoom, that is in the Q&A function at the bottom center of your screen. And if you're on Facebook, that's in the comment field. So our third speaker is my colleague and fellow analyst at SCEEUS, Jakob Hedenskog. Jakob, please share with us your thoughts on all this.
Thank you, Hugo. It's great to be here and share this panel with you and Erika and Svante. I will focus in my introduction here on the Russian motives behind the CSTO intervention and the consequences for Russia. Because first, when we say the CSTO intervention, we see it was mainly a Russian intervention, actually, with 3,000 peacekeepers from Russia, 500 from Belarus, 200 from Tajikistan, and even less from Kyrgyzstan and Armenia. Russia had numerous motives for its CSTO intervention in Kazakhstan. As with all Russian foreign policy, the overall goals of regime survival, power consolidation, both domestically and abroad, particularly in its desired sphere of interests, and countering other actors, mainly the West, were all relevant here. Given that the first reason for Russia to intervene in Kazakhstan was that Kazakhstan was simply too important for Russia to be lost. We all know that Kazakhstan is the largest country in the Central Asia, and with a largely unprotected border with Russia. It has been a buffer zone against potential military threats from the south for Russia, and Russia has 4 military installations in Kazakhstan. It has a large Russian minority, 3.5 million, about 18% of the population. And Kazakhstan is a key strategic ally for Russia, both a member of CSTO and the Eurasian Economic Union. The second main motive for Russia was to counter so-called color revolutions that have been mentioned already. A key goal of Russia is to prevent regime change in its neighborhood, disturbances in Kazakhstan, not to mention the risk of toppling of its regime, had the potential to start a chain reaction in a region already destabilized and under threat of spreading extremism from Afghanistan. Russia has long accused the West of spurring so-called color revolutions in the post-Soviet space and claimed that the ultimate goal of these color revolutions is regime change in Russia itself. While Russia was quite unprepared for the first wave of color revolutions, those in Georgia, Ukraine, and Kyrgyzstan in the early 2000s, it has responded faster to the more recent protests, such as the Euromaidan revolution in Ukraine and the protests in Belarus in 2020, which was interpreted by Russia as an attempt for a color revolution. This time in Kazakhstan, Moscow quickly took the initiative before the situation could spiral out of control, thereby demonstrating that it has learned lessons and become a more proactive, flexible, and resolved security actor in its neighborhood. In the virtual CSTO meeting on 10th of January 2022, Putin stated that color revolutions would not be allowed in our countries. The third motive was to raise the international reputation of the CSTO as a competent and responsible security provider. The CSTO's effectiveness and willingness to deploy troops has been called in question before. The organization has long been accused by many of being a paper tiger, able neither to unite its member states nor to come to their aid in their hour of need. It has also been perceived as an instrument of Russian influence and thus met little enthusiasm from other member countries. The intervention in Kazakhstan gave the CSTO much needed positive credentials among its members, state governments, which are, with Armenia and Kyrgyzstan as only exceptions, authoritarian states. Russia now sends the signal to its neighboring regimes that CSTO is a competent organization for managing unrest and threats to the governing authorities. This was the first time that Article 4 in the CSTO Treaty, which is similar to NATO's Article 5 on collective defense, was invoked, and the CSTO deployed its collective rapid reaction forces. Similar requests have been declined previously, such from Kyrgyzstan in 2010 and Armenia in 2021. The purpose of Article 4 is to counter outside threats, and Kyrgyzstan's request in 2010 was denied precisely on the basis that the protests that led to the request were an internal matter. Tokayev's argument that the crisis was a result of external aggression made it possible to invoke Article 4. Even if such claims of external intervention lack any support from reported facts on the ground, this is the narrative that commonly used among post-Soviet authoritarian regimes to explain similar protests. The decision to meet the request for intervention was most of all taken by political interests. The fact that there was no conflict between Kazakhstan and another major Russian ally made it easier. Compared to Karabakh conflict, where Armenia requested help from CSTO in its conflict with Azerbaijan, which had withdrawn from CSTO in 1999. Nevertheless, relations with Azerbaijan is very important for Russia. So the rationale became that the conflict in Karabakh was taking place inside Azerbaijan. It had to be defined as an internal conflict and did not meet the criteria to trigger Article 4. Also, it would have been much more difficult, for instance, to intervene in a conflict between, let's say, Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, two countries with the recurrent border conflict, but also both countries are members of the CSTO. Finally, what are the consequences for Russia? The CSTO deployment had several crucial positive consequences for Russia. Importantly, it will probably enhance Russia's influence in Kazakhstan and Central Asia and diminish that of other actors. It will make it more difficult for Kazakhstan to pursue a multi-vector foreign policy, balancing the interests of Russia, China, and the West. Kazakhstan's regime will become more dependent on Russia for its survival, and Russia's clout will grow stronger while the influence of Western actors in China is potentially weakened. Given China's big increase in economic influence in the region, which Russia cannot match, the likely biggest loser of the interest will be the West. I agree with Erika that China is much more important in economic field, and Russia can only provide security, but not economy needs for Central Asian states. Also Turkey, which promotes the Turkic word, a concept that encompasses Kazakhstan and expressed readiness to support the Kazakhstan regime, ultimately played no role on the ground. Russia will also strengthen its influence over CSTO members such as Armenia and Belarus. The decision to send CSTO troops to Kazakhstan was formally taken by Armenia's Prime Minister Pashinyan, who is the chairman of the CSTO Collective Security Council. Pashinyan himself came to power after widespread street protests, and now he contributed to help the regime to quell the protests. Both Armenia and Belarus sent soldiers abroad, Belarus for the first time, and arguably shows Russia's influence over these countries. The success of the primary objective of the intervention to quell the protests and support a Kremlin-friendly regime sent a strong signal that Russia is the main security provider in Central Asia and the post-Soviet space, and boosts Russia's narrative of being a partner willing to be able to rescue friendly regimes and provide them with security stability, such as Russia also has done in Syria since 2015. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Jakob. We have gotten several interesting questions from the audience, and I will start with a few of them. So first off, what is Russia's view on the fact that it seems that China is more successful than Russia in Central Asia in some respects? And how does this affect or is affected by the current situation, by our topic today? Perhaps Erika would like to answer that first, or if anyone else of you would like to start off.
Well, I'm not sure I'm the best person to answer how Russia views the situation, but based on the study that we did a few years ago, I think it was quite apparent that Russian interlocutors that we spoke to, they sort of wanted to frame the situation in Central Asia as sort of a purposeful division of labor. Like Russia wants to do security and China wants to do economy. And I think that's true for the Chinese part. And I think for the Russian part, they just have to accept that they can't compete in the economic sphere.
Thank you, Erika. Svante, would you like to continue?
Well, perhaps just a short observation. I think to me, the interesting difference is how, I mean, Russia is faced with, should we call it Chinese encroachment from the east and Western encroachment from the west. But the way the Russians treat China and the way Russians treat the West is very different. They don't seem to be very much afraid of the West. They seem to be very aggressive, as we see right now in their dealings with Western countries. Whereas if we are seeing how they deal with China, they're extremely careful and extremely cautious. There are big differences between them. I remember a foreign minister of one of the biggest Central Asian countries telling me and a colleague maybe 3 years ago that there is a serious rivalry between Russia and China in Central Asia, but we don't see that. And we don't see that because the Russians are very, very careful not to alienate the Chinese and would never provoke the Chinese the way they're provoking the West, which leads me to think that maybe we should look at how the Chinese are dealing with the Russians. Maybe we can even learn something from it. But joking aside, I think the Russians have drawn the conclusion that the Chinese rise in this part of the world is unstoppable. And the best they can do is to become a junior partner, whereas they think that the West is weak and divided and that they can exacerbate and further that trend to their own benefit.
Thank you. Jakob, continuing on that thread, if we're speaking about this, that Russia is becoming a junior partner to China, how is the security balance in Central Asia affected? What does these events and the CSTO intervention, what does that mean for the security balance in Central Asia?
Well, as I said in my introduction, it strengthened Russia's security, security aspect in the region. However, although the balance between China and Russia, where Russia is security and China is economy, I think that balance would more or less more and more be to China's benefit, since China is investing more and more and that is building this infrastructure in the Belt and Road Initiative, and have more and more projects in Central Asia, which will have to be safeguarded by security aspects, security arrangements. So this competition or the rival situation will more and more be to China's benefit also in the security sphere, I would say. China, for instance, they have so much influence in Tajikistan. Tajikistan is being more and more a Chinese protectorate, and they have a military base there, and so it will just be more and more of China also in the security sphere in the whole region.
Thank you. So another audience question. that I would like to ask Svante. Is it possible for Russia to create a similar situation in northern Kazakhstan that we have already seen in the Donbass region in eastern Ukraine and in northern Georgia? Are there similarities here, or could there be future similarities here in northern Kazakhstan? And why northern Kazakhstan?
I think the Georgia situation is different because we're talking in the case of Georgia about non-Russian minorities that have autonomous status had autonomous status in the Soviet period, which Russia used to its advantage in the transition period. The logic is the same, but it's a slight difference. The cases of Donbass and North Kazakhstan are much more similar. They're very similar to each other. And people in Kazakhstan felt that very strongly when the events in Donbass took place. Now, I think, so the answer to your question is yes, potentially. This is, by the way, in my introductory remarks, I referred to the general Kazakh approach to political change, and especially their very skeptical, very hostile approach to uncontrolled political liberalization, or what we call color revolutions, or what some people call regime change. And that is exactly related to the question you asked. If you ask generally people in Kazakhstan, by the way, not only the leadership, about Ukraine, they will say, well, of course, they're not supportive of what Russia has done, but they say, but Ukraine should not have allowed the internal instability to emerge to such a degree that they gave the Russians the opportunity to do this. Now, this might be right or wrong. That's not the point. The point of that is the perception in Kazakhstan, and I would say in many other countries in the region, which is, by the way, why, in a certain way, Russia's behavior, which we have not really understood in the West, has strengthened some authoritarian tendencies. Because if you have this threat from Russia, you have to maintain tighter control of your political system. I mean, imagine if the Russians are able to involve themselves in Western elections the way they are. Imagine what they're doing in Central Asian countries, Caucasus countries, Moldova, and so on. And then anyway, so I think the point is that from the Kazakh point of view, one of the highest priorities of the Kazakh leadership has been to maintain stability within the country, keep inter-ethnic relations under control, and keep functioning relations with Russia, while at the same time trying to build independence. It's a very difficult tightrope that they're trying to walk. But I think one of the major driving forces from 1991 up until today has been exactly this question. I mean, they have gone so, I would say they have gone so far as to relocate the capital of the country from Almaty to what is now Astana or Nur-Sultan, exactly because of this reason, to make the north of Kazakhstan more Kazakh, to have a better political presence in the north of the country, which is of course heavily populated by ethnic Russians. Now, thankfully, because Kazakhstan has been relatively successful, there is no real, demand for among ethnic Russians for some kind of reunification or unification with Russia. But then again, that didn't exist in Eastern Ukraine either. So that's not a guarantee.
Thank you, Svante. Erika, related to some of what Svante just said about the role of Russia in helping these countries with security issues, what is the view of the other Central Asian countries on what happened in Kazakhstan? And will they be more or less reluctant or willing to turn to Russia for help in solving what is, well, we think internal disturbances, internal issues mainly?
My understanding is that some of the Central Asian states are already part of the CSTO, and Tajikistan is pretty much dependent on Russia for its own security. Without Russian troops in Tajikistan, it wouldn't be able to handle its own security. So I think those states are were perhaps less skeptical of Kazakhstan calling in the CSTO, but I read a very interesting report about Uzbekistan's reaction to what happened. And apparently Uzbekistan asked Kazakhstan not to call in the CSTO. And that's sort of very indicative of the Uzbekistan position, which is that they want to keep Russia far away. They don't want Russian troops in their territory. They don't want Russian troops close to their territory. And also, which was also very interesting, was that supposedly Lukashenko had said to Uzbekistan that, look, how great is it to have, CSTO, they can help you out if there's a crisis. But apparently Uzbekistan has responded to that if ever such a crisis were to occur, they would be able to handle it themselves. So there are sort of very different positions in the region towards Russia, and the concerns are similar, but the strategies to handle the problem, so to speak, are quite different.
See, thank you, Erika. Jakob, I would like to ask you a question about something we touched upon and you touched upon earlier, regarding the way this all played out for the former President Nazarbayev, that was ousted from his positions where he still had a lot of power. And I would like to ask you, do you think Putin draws any conclusions from this regarding his own future? Does this, because we know that Putin has also, or probably has plans for somehow managing transitional power, and he can't sit forever. Nobody lives forever. So what do you think about this?
Well, I think the problem of transition is not only for Putin, it's for all those authoritarian leaders, including Lukashenko, and also in Tajikistan, Rahmon and others. So I think they draw the conclusion that this is a very risky way, the sort of Kazakh scenario that the former leader leaves, but still rules from behind, and so I think that is something. It only worked for like 2.5 years, and it seems a very risky arrangement. So I think that this was probably something that Lukashenko was thinking about. That in Belarus there will be a referendum in 27th of February on a new or amended constitution, and he has there was speculation at least until last year that this sort of Kazakh scenario could be applicable for Belarus, but according to the proposed amendments in the constitution, this is not the way that they are trying to solve that problem now.
Thank you. So we've talked about Kazakhstan, of course, but we've also talked about Russia, China, other Central Asian countries. But we haven't mentioned one big global player, that is the West, the collective West, including the US, the EU. And where is the West in all of this? How did the West respond to what happened? And we know that the West have interests in this region also. Does all of this have any implications for the role of the West and the interests of the West in Kazakhstan specifically, and in Central Asia more generally? Svante, would you like to answer that, please?
Well, thank you. I mean, I think I wasn't entirely surprised that the West was more or less irrelevant in the situation in Kazakhstan. This we could already see 1.5 years ago in the war between Armenia and Azerbaijan. The West was completely irrelevant in that conflict. It was really only Russia and Turkey, to some very limited extent Iran. Well, I should add Israel, of course, was very relevant in that. But the West was, the Minsk group was completely sidelined by the Russians and the Turks, and well, there was no reaction, nothing. So I think in that sense, Kazakhstan being even further away, although there is a much bigger business interest, we should note that. But I wasn't entirely surprised. What I think is clear is that the US withdrawal from Afghanistan and the way that took place led people in the region to draw their conclusions. Therefore, for the leadership of Kazakhstan, appealing to the West for help was entirely unrealistic. You know, maybe you would get some advisor come to you 3 months from now, whereas what they needed was something immediate. And the only options were Russia and China in this case. And I think partly for reasons that Erika already outlined, the Russian option was preferable to the Chinese option, not least because the Kazakhs also knew that the Chinese did not want any presence of Russian troops in Kazakhstan, and therefore they could use China as a leverage to get the Russians to leave again. I think that was also important in the calculation. But I think the broader question is that the West does not know really what its interests in Kazakhstan are. There are strategy documents, there are papers, but there is no actual policy. The European Union has been much more active than the United States has been, by the way, which I would never have believed if somebody had told me that 15 years ago. The EU has a real policy process in place with bi-yearly, every 2 years, Council conclusions on Central Asia and relations with Central Asia and so forth. But the problem is still that the West has been so entirely preoccupied by its internal problems and by the Ukraine crisis and the relations with Russia that there has been no bandwidth. And I'm talking about at the level of individual, government offices, as you know very well. Very often the same people who are working on Ukraine are the ones responsible for Kazakhstan, especially at the higher levels, and there's simply no time. I think that's the reality we are going to have for the foreseeable future. That, of course, doesn't mean that there are no interests. I think it is quite significant that in spite of the violence, in spite of the large number of dead people and the tensions that took place, there has been a relatively mild reaction from the West. Of course, the European Parliament and human rights organizations have done what they're supposed to do. But there has been a level of understanding, I think, from Western governments that the best card we have, if you will, the best partners we have in Kazakhstan right now is President Tokayev and his forces. There is disagreement on whether he is really intending to engage in reforms or whether that's just cosmetic, but nobody sees any option that's better for Kazakhstan or for the relationship between the West and Kazakhstan at this point. The question is, what do you do? How do you make a difference? And I think there is really no serious thinking aside from the traditional aid programs on how to support the process. But I think right now, if you are looking at the situation, you see that for Kazakhstan to be successful, for the reform process to be successful, China is not going to be a factor in that. Russia is not going to be a factor. Iran and Turkey are not going to be factors. It's really about the only external support for a reform process would come from the West. I think that's what the Kazakhs want, but obviously the question will be in the details and whether the West is prepared to show up.
Thank you. So I'm going to go with another audience question here, and I think I'm going to ask it to Erika. So we know that China have this very large goal of recreating a new Silk Road with its Belt and Road initiative. How does this have? What's the role of this new initiative in relation to Kazakhstan and to its security, in relation to Central Asia and the relations between Russia and China here?
Well, I think I can only give a pretty general answer, and that's that the whole region, Central Asia, plays a role because, it's kind of hard to define what the Belt and Road Initiative is, but because it's quite a big project, if you can call it that, it's more like an idea or an umbrella, if you will, that sort of the goal is to connect China with the rest of the world. And there are, there's infrastructure projects and the building of railroads through Central Asia from China to Europe. There's a digital Silk Road, which is, connecting digitally with the whole world. There are so many different components, but Central Asia is important in terms of energy and infrastructure. And I'm not sure, I think maybe Jakob can answer this better, if there's much of a rivalry between Russia and China in terms of the Belt and Road, because to a certain extent, I think Russia will also be able to benefit from some of these investments that China is going to do.
Thank you. So another audience question that is a very big, important question, but also very difficult. Therefore, I'm gonna go give it to you, Jakob. I'm sorry, but is the world order moving from unipolar to multipolar? These events, do they reflect that?
Well, thank you. Well, I think I would say it's undisputable that we are moving, if we are not already there, in a multipolar world. That decades ago that we could talk about the bipolar world and was during the Cold War, and then in the 1990s maybe and the early 2000s we could speak about the unipolar world with the US as the only superpower. But with the decline of the US in more general and the terms, and also the rising of China, and also more regional powers like India, Brazil, Turkey, or whatever, it makes it sense to say that we are in a multipolar world, and that will be strength. And Russia, of course, now I will get angry emails from those that support Russia, but Russia is what. Who said that? Was it Obama, that Russia was a regional power, and he was immediately so yeah, we are in a multipolar world. We have to accept it.
Svante, would you like to add to that?
Yes, I think just a short observation. I think the question is, I think Russia would like us to be in a multipolar world. I fear we are in a non-polar world. Both French and other American writers have been launching this idea, and it's not perfect, but I think we're in a situation where Russia, in spite of everything we're seeing, is a declining power. All the powers that are trying to assert themselves in the wake of the fading unipolar moment, as they now call it, have serious internal problems. You look at the Turks, you look at the Iranians, the Chinese, Indians, and so forth. Everybody has serious internal problems, and maybe one of the reasons they're exerting, Saudis, why they're, trying to project power outside their boundaries is to counter the weaknesses domestically. So we'll see. But I think the such a position with a lack of real powers that are able to organize the world is maybe a bigger problem than what the unipolar or multipolar would be.
It's very interesting. Thank you. So I would like to dedicate these last minutes to looking forward. So I will start with you, Jakob. Will this CSTO intervention, will this be a future model for Russian crisis management in this neighborhood? And will this increase the role of CSTO and indirectly Russia in dealing with other internal disturbances in its neighborhood?
Well, as I said in my introduction, this could be used as a sort of role model for saving authoritarian regimes in Russia's neighborhood. However, they are maybe not that many, and so it will not be. It cannot be used in more than the CSTO countries, of course, and also with the regard that they are not any external intervention from another CSTO country, or from it would be also difficult to use it, from any kind of the external intervention from another great power. So it has some positive effects for Russia, but I guess in a limited way when it comes to how often it can be used.
Thank you. And now sorry, Svante, I saw you turned on your mic. Did you? Erika, also looking ahead, what is I mean, the rest of Asia is, of course, is a very big question, but how will the rest of Asia see Russia and its role as a security guarantor in these and other internal issues, including China, Iran, if we're looking ahead?
I feel like we see a trend towards a lot of Asian states becoming closer to Russia. I mean, if we look at Central Asia and what's happening, many of the surrounding states, they seem to sort of accept that, yeah, it's great that Russia could handle this situation. And if we look at, for example, Afghanistan, there's a sense with all the surrounding countries that they're going to have to deal with this themselves. And a plausible forum for that is going to be the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, where Russia is a part. If we look at what's happening in Ukraine, it's pretty interesting to see that, India more or less said that they understood the Russian position. So, going back to your earlier question about multipolarity and things, I think we're seeing also a huge ideological conflict emerging, because we have democratic values and authoritarian values, and they are beginning to clash.
Yeah, I agree with you. So last question to Svante, going back to where we started. Again, looking ahead we're going to Kazakhstan now again. Will Tokayev succeed in consolidating his power? Will he succeed in getting through some reforms to make the people happier, to make sure that similar protests won't happen again? It's a big question, so you have 2 minutes.
I don't have an answer, but I think this struggle was really about the control over the state. And I think there is no question that President Tokayev, at least in a preliminary way, has won the battle of control over the state. And to a certain extent, I see parallels to President Mirziyoyev in Uzbekistan, because when he came to power, succeeding Islam Karimov, he faced very serious internal opposition, not least from the State Security Ministry. By the way, it's not a coincidence that the state security services were the ones allegedly involved in the problems in Kazakhstan. They tend to be the bastions of old-fashioned, should we say, thinking in post-Soviet states. To make a long story short, Mirziyoyev appealed directly to the people for support against the entrenched figures by presenting himself as a reformer. Implementation is a different question, of course, but he succeeded in this way. And I think Mr. Tokayev might be able, or is using the same appeal. Everybody at this point understands that the old forces will not be tolerated. And it's very important that the protests were not directed against Tokayev, they were directed against Nazarbayev, who was a symbol largely because of his family's behavior for what people think is wrong with Kazakhstan. The jury is out on Tokayev, if you will. But now that he's in charge, it will be up to him to deliver. And I think it's a big country with big challenges, but also big ambitions. It's going to be a difficult job, but I think there is, shall we say, low-hanging fruit in terms of reforming things like the taxation system, the customs, that type of things, which could be done thanks to technological advancement, for example, and which could eliminate a large part of the corruption, which I think he definitely would like to do. because I think at some point leaders like Tokayev see corruption not as something that is helpful to their power, but something that's a danger to their power, at least petty corruption. Now, if the demands from society extend beyond well-functioning government and delivery of services, which I think they can improve, but if extend to a more political liberalization of the country, then we're going to be in a different situation. That I think is going to be much harder to accomplish, at least in the short term.
Thank you. So unfortunately, we will have to stop there, although there are many more interesting questions and issues that could be discussed in this topic. So thank you very much, Svante Cornell, Erika Holmqvist, and Jakob Hedenskog for this very interesting and informing discussion and webinar today, which was co-organized by the Stockholm Centre for Eastern European Studies, SCEEUS, and the Institute for Security and Development Policy, ISDP. I would also like to thank the audience for tuning in and contributing with very good questions. And please note again that a recording of this webinar will soon be available on the website of the Swedish Institute of International Affairs, ui.se, where you will also find many more interesting webinars and reports. So thank you, everyone, and goodbye. Have a nice day.
Thank you.
Thank you, Hugo.
Thank you.